Hari Om. This morning we're going to try to cover one of the most important teachings of Sri Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. This teaching is actually the very first teaching that's given in the second chapter, beginning with verse 11. Actually, most pundits and most scholars of Sanskrit and the Bhagavad Gita themselves say that although we have now undergone an entire explanation of the battlefield, which is very significant and esoteric and has great knowledge for us and guidance, that actually the Lord spoke first in the second chapter, 11th verse, when after Sri Krishna had observed Arjuna lamenting and actually then throwing down his bow and arrows and saying, "I will not fight," he smiled, or began to smile, and then said this. The Blessed Lord spoke, "You have mourned for those who should not be mourned for, and you speak words as if with wisdom. The wise do not mourn, either for the dead or for the living." And the very next verse, now that Sri Krishna has designated a difference between the living and the dead, he goes on in the 12th verse of the second chapter to say, "Truly there never was a time when I was not, nor you, nor these lords of men, and neither will there be a time when we shall cease to be from this time onward." So the paradox that's presented to us in the first teaching of the Bhagavad Gita is that the Lord Sri Krishna is saying there never was a time, nor there never will be a time, when we will never cease to be, when that eternal essence, the self, which is divine and pervades our own consciousness and our own being, it is eternal. But just prior to this, he's declared, don't mourn for the living or the dead. So how can an eternal being, which time does not touch, at one moment be living and the next moment be dead? And so we should look into the actual words that Sri Krishna used, because this first teaching is pivotal to understand the way that we will ascend back to experience and live in that eternity. For the enigma of spiritual practice is, though we are eternal, we don't live that way. It is not manifested in our consciousness to the fullest and perfect degree. Again, as we spoke earlier, the Buddha said, pasidana, meaning achieve completion, achieve this full manifestation of divinity through spiritual practice and unfoldment of perception of that divinity. So, if we can understand that Sri Krishna is definitely saying there is the living and the dead, what is the difference? The word Sri Krishna uses in the 11th verse of the second chapter is gata sun for living and agata sun for dead. They come from the Sanskrit root gata and asu. Gata simply means the gone, to be gone. So we must understand what is gone and where has it gone. The key is in the second root of this word, which is asu. Asu means breath. So here Sri Krishna is saying the only difference between the living and the dead is that when we are living, we have possession of breath. When breath is gone, when breath departs from us, we are now considered dead. But that eternal being is unconditioned by breath, but our mind and our consciousness is definitely conditioned by breath. And therefore, this is why throughout all major religions, from Christianity in the West to Hinduism and Buddhism in the East, and even further into the Chinese cultures, the breath was significant, because they all understood that if the breath is the key between living and dead, looked at esoterically, between living consciousness and dull or dead consciousness, breath also has a significant factor. So, this is why breath and breath awareness and cultivation of the breath is paramount for spiritual practice. Because we want definitely the breath to not only be with us, which is inherited and given to us in the most physical sense, but being spiritual beings, we need to cultivate and cause the breath to manifest in such a way that we will literally become aware of the breather of the breath. The one who gave us the breath is imbued in the breath itself, for breath is prana, which is life force, pneuma, spiritus, consciousness. So this is why we want to pay attention to the breath. So this is the very first teaching Sri Krishna gave to Arjuna and to us in the Bhagavad Gita, designating that the only thing that will cause a transference of consciousness is whether breath is vivid and living or departed. So in our spiritual practice, we need to cultivate the breath, and therefore because the connection between breath and mind, because breath and body connection is the absolute designation of living and dead, the connection between breath and mind, between consciousness and superconsciousness, is indicated. So what does this mean? How can you cultivate the breath? The Buddhists do it with breath meditation, by watching the movement of the breath, by being aware of the movement of the breath, and as we consciously pay attention to the breath and its movement, the mind begins to slow down, because attendance to the breath causes it to relax. It's literally, our consciousness is a healing factor. The actual concentration of our mind and heart on an object causes it to become relaxed. This is why when we're in an agitated state, the breath becomes violent, agitated, and irregular. When we're in a peaceful state, when we're in a state of calm and serenity, then the breath becomes calm, easing, and slight. So in meditation, even though we're using a mantra or contemplating some verse of a scripture, there are so many forms of meditation, the idea is awareness of the movement of the breath should be, in a sense, the backdrop. Because the nature of the mind is to move so much, even like a monkey. And what we should do is, we should concentrate on the movement of the breath, and that will cause the mind to calm down and to slow down. And then in the calming and slowing of the mental faculties, the breather of the breath will manifest before our consciousness. Now this takes, of course, time and practice. But the idea is that to have breath and be living, and to have awareness of that which gave us life through awareness of the breath, is the key factor that's given to us in this very first teaching of Sri Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita.